So we're all ready. Good morning. I'm Ramesh Kari from the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department here at NYU. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the 5th Cybersecurity Lecture, or as we call it here, the Sloan Lecture. The IEEE Sloan Foundation has been a sponsor of this lecture series since its inception, and we are incredibly grateful to them for their support of science, technology, public policy, and other aspects that inform cybersecurity here in New York City, and especially here at NYU. Today's lecture is entitled Surviving on a Diet of Poisoned Fruit, and it will explore the risks involved as our society becomes more interconnected and the transfer of data, whether it be personal, financial, or otherwise, increases at an exponential rate. We have an amazing set of speakers for you today, and before we get started, I want to introduce our president and Dean, Kattepalli Srinivasan. Dean Srinivasan served as the last president of the second oldest engineering school in the country and presided over the merger with NYU this past January. Professor Srinivasan has made a point of stating that as a school of engineering, we have a responsibility to not only our faculty, not only our students, but also to our community and society at large. Engineering is about bringing technology to society, and under his leadership, the NYU Polytechnic School of Engineering has grown in esteem, climbing 21 places in the national rankings, and as a partner with both government and the private sector. Please welcome our Dean, Kattepalli Srinivasan.
Thank you, Ramesh. Your comments make me sweat. Anyhow, I echo Ramesh and welcome all of you with great pleasure to this event, which is the 5th Sloan Lecture organized in our school. 5 years ago, we started this off by discussing how public and private partnerships can best defend cyberspace. The third year involved the rise of big data and how that affects privacy. Last year, we tackled how cybersecurity risks affect the nation and its infrastructure. Today, we come together once again through the support of the Sloan Foundation to probe the inherent vulnerabilities that weaken the nation's cybersecurity systems. Our distinguished lecturer will call for comprehensive changes in the safety of vital information stores. We would like to think that our students and researchers are at the forefront of building more secure cyber technologies and cyber systems. This is not on, or maybe I am too far away from this. This may be better. Okay, I'll repeat that last sentence. Our students and researchers, we think, are at the forefront of building more secure cybersecurity technologies and systems. This conference is a crucial guideline for us, and I'm very pleased to say that, like the last few lectures, we have very distinguished people who will not only be presenting the lecture, but also be a part of the forum. I want to say that a number of people are involved in making this lecture or a lecture like this, an event like this happen. And I should thank a number of people here, but actually I'll just thank only 3 by name. Just please assume that all others are included. The first person I should say some good words about is Nasir Memon, who is not here, but who will be listening to me anyhow from somewhere. I should mention that in his own quiet way, Nasir has led the effort in bolstering our strengths in this area here. The second person that I should mention is Ramesh Kari, who you already met. He has taken academic and research leadership roles in this effort, particularly the hardware part. This is an area in which clearly there is greater urgency. The third is Bob Ubel. When I mention Bob, I mean to include all members of his team. Bob is the key to our online cybersecurity master's degree program, which has been recognized as one of the outstanding ones in the country. He's also instrumental, as I said, in organizing these lectures. Now I should say a few words, which is really what I'm here for, and that is to introduce Dr. Paula Olszewski, the program director in microbiology of built environment, synthetic biology, and biosecurity at the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, who is our sponsor for this event. Among other things, Paula oversees the Foundation's Public Service Awards. She has worked on the boards of EPS Homeland Security Research Subcommittee and the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism. She is a graduate of Yale and MIT, and we are very fortunate to have her giving the opening remarks today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Paula Olszewski to the stage.
Good morning. Thank you for that kind introduction. I want to thank the faculty and staff here at NYU Poly for doing an outstanding job on the previous 4 lectures series, and I'm sure this will be another great one. It really is a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to, in my opening remarks, which will be brief, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Sloan Foundation. I'm going to describe a relevant current initiative, and then I get to introduce the next speaker. What is the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation? The Sloan Foundation is a philanthropic organization. We do our work by giving grants. We give grants in the broad areas of research and education in STEM fields: science, technology, engineering, also includes economics, and math. I'd like to note that Mr. Sloan actually is from Brooklyn and was an engineer and who went to MIT. So it's quite nice that we're in Brooklyn today, but since the Sloan Foundation is located in New York City, a significant part of our portfolio is devoted to activities in New York City that we think fit our mission and will improve life in the city. And so this particular grant definitely fits. Today's keynote speaker, the Honorable Richard Danzig, is a longtime Sloan grantee. I've worked with Richard on biosecurity and nuclear security, so it came as no surprise to me that Richard is now providing leadership in cybersecurity, and I look forward to his remarks. Now my next point. Cybersecurity is really a big issue. I wanted to start a program at the foundation in 2007, but the problem is I'm a biochemist. I don't have computer science background, IT, and so on. I have a very good security background. But that said, I still try to do what I can. But cybersecurity is part of a bigger issue, and that is sort of a bigger field, computing and IT. This is really the 21st century. So we know there are very big problems with cybersecurity. And again, anybody who read Richard's piece, I mean, that's really scary. But there's really an extraordinarily large issue facing us, and that is the workforce. Where are the women? Where are the minorities? If they're leaking out of the pipeline, why? If they're not getting into the pipeline, why? So we at the Sloan Foundation think this is a very serious problem. For all of our grants, we require that there be participation by women and minorities. We just, we give money, that buck really stops here. So anyway, in this particular case, we have very good grantees. I'm the woman on the panel. Okay, a biochemist from MIT who's a biosecurity expert. Not bad. But so we have an initiative now that we call WICIT, Women in Computing and IT. And we are going to figure out what is wrong here. We've commissioned grants to look at the data, the history, and the culture, because there's something really insidious in this field that has to change if we are going to address cybersecurity, have an open and free society, and great national security. So anyway, that's my assessment of the current situation, which needs to be changed. So now, let me switch to part 3, and that is I have the great pleasure of asking Jerry Hulton to introduce our distinguished lecturer. Before he comes up, let me say a few words about NYU's Senior Presidential Fellow Hulton. First of all, he's no stranger to these parts. He served as the president of the Polytechnic Institute, where he's the major force behind the merger between NYU and Poly. He was a huge proponent of the concept of invention, innovation, and entrepreneurship as part of the DNA of the School of Engineering. Now, this is the part I really like. Jerry served as Undersecretary of the Navy under our esteemed speaker today, and I'm sure he'll regale us with tales of their time together in the Clinton administration. Please welcome Jerry Hulton to the stage.
So in the 1990s, someone had an idea in the Pentagon. You know how big the Pentagon is. It's actually one of the largest buildings in the world. But the idea was this: let's take a little bottle of peppermint flavor and hold it up to an air intake and see what happens. So this is a Richard Danzig type experiment. The question is, how vulnerable is the Pentagon to a biological attack? So peppermint in the air vent. Within 10 minutes, the other side of the Pentagon, acres away, peppermint flavor wafting out of the air conditioning system. Aha, we are vulnerable. So whether that experiment occurred before or after Richard took on biological attack as a threat to this nation, he can tell you. But I know a demonstration goes a long ways to getting people to believe they're in peril. And this was a fantastic demonstration. So nowadays, if you were in the Pentagon, though, the whiff you would get would be virtual, and it would be the whiff of attack from someplace else. And it would come exuding out of the air vents called computers and computational power. And it's as dramatic, so much so that one friend of mine in the Pentagon said if we wanted to, we could declare war against nations in this world based on what they're doing to us now. So we're still waiting, though, for the big demonstration. In the meantime, the reason Richard Danzig is special is because he can articulate and demonstrate and make the case so that others begin to act and change their behavior. He did that with biological. Fantastic. And it changed the way we pursued these issues. There's a second time it came up. I was undersecretary, he was secretary, and here's what we discovered. In the Navy's business operations, the $60, $70 billion that's not the ships and the planes, that procures and maintains and houses everything we have, trains, we had 400 wide area networks supporting 100,000 applications. Each one of these wide area networks had its own security system, its own passwords, its own effort to protect itself. But we, Secretary of the Navy, Undersecretary of the Navy, had no idea of whether they were well maintained, poorly maintained, and they were terribly expensive. So we had an idea, one common intranet across the system, the Navy Marine Corps corporate intranet. We took it on. It was a major battle with the bureaucracy above us because they wanted us to use their system. But we prevailed, and the ultimate outcome was from a $3 billion IT bill, we reduced it to a $2 billion a year bill. But you're probably saying, good work, Jerry. You now have moved all of IT in the Navy to one system. So if you attack that system, voila, you are home. You have broken into everything. So as we gained efficiency, we created risk. And I think you'll hear as we listen to Richard's description that as we gain efficiency, build a global economy using IT, we've actually increased the risk. Therefore, what we do to prevent the risk goes up. So I find Richard's role in our society really important. I've named 2 times biological, the Navy Marine Corps corporate internet, and now the 3rd time, cyber. And you'll hear him articulate this case today. So as someone who I went to law school with, someone whom I've been in political campaigns with, someone whom I've been in the Pentagon with, I want to introduce who I view as one of the sharpest knives in the drawer. This is someone who really thinks clearly, digs deeply, and sorts out hype from reality. Final thought as I leave this stage is I, like Paul, I think this is a big problem. I keep asking, where's the equivalent of what we did with nuclear? Read Ike's Bluff and understand what went on in the 50s to begin to contend with the threat of nuclear war. Or where's Billy Mitchell and the rise of air power as a force in the world? So we have, I think, ground to cover. And Richard's bringing us across that ground, but there's a lot more to do. So if you're a young student here or a faculty member, my challenge is don't rest. Listen carefully, learn hard, and move on this issue. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend, Richard Danzig.
In hearing what I have to say. First of all, it's just a pleasure to see so many friends, and particularly nice to have you introduce me, Jerry. It's downright nostalgic, though I must admit I sort of had a wave of fear when I heard Paula say that you should regale the audience with anecdotes from days gone by. So as much as anything else, I appreciate your restraint, Jerry. It's also particularly nice to be here because there's a central connection between the kind of work I tried to do and the work that you all are doing here at NYU Polytechnic, and that is, I think, at the core of this lecture series sponsored by Sloan, which, as Paula says, I'm already indebted to on a number of other counts. Note how graciously Paula emphasizes the indebtedness. The effort that I undertook is really a slightly odd one in that I am not trained in the world of computer science. My cybersecurity knowledge was modestly of a layman's type. I'm on the President's Intelligence Advisory Board and various other policy boards that give me some access to some of this material. But I didn't feel that I had enough time in those contexts to really think out this area. And I wanted to try and develop that further. And I should emphasize what I have to say today speaks for me as an individual, not on behalf of any of the institutions with which I'm affiliated. But what I wanted to do was 3 things. One was try and understand this area for myself. The second was to figure out how to present it to policymakers, particularly in the national security realm. It's very complex, it rapidly changes, it's very unfamiliar to them. Most senior policymakers have grown up in a world in which cybersecurity was not a dominant issue. And they have a very quick, intuitive understanding of what an aircraft carrier is, or even of what nuclear policy and decision-making needs to be about. But they are, in a well-known phrase, digital immigrants rather than digital natives. They don't have that kind of familiarity in an everyday way with these issues. And so what happens is many of the technologies, in my view, are evolving faster than our comprehension of them, and policymakers fall behind. And I'll have some more to say about this in the course of my talk, but a major challenge for me was to take advantage of the fact that I began from a state of ignorance, to try and figure out not only what was going on, but also how to convey that to busy decision makers. And I'll offer you some examples in the course of this talk of efforts on my part to try and make intricate technical things make common sense to decision makers. And then the third thing is to try and figure out what we should do about this. There's a wonderful statement about Bronson Alcott, who was the father of Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women. This is not a bid for feminist perspective in the cyber area. Bronson Alcott was a philosopher and abolitionist, and it was said of Bronson Alcott that he soared into the infinite and fathomed the unfathomable, but never paid cash. And the reason I like that statement and bring it to mind is I think it's quite a striking thing to admire the problem of cybersecurity, stand back from it and explain it in all its intricacy, figure out how to present it, soar into the infinite and fathom the unfathomable. But unless we pay cash in terms of actually rendering policy advice, what should we do given all this, we don't get where we need to go. So my effort is on a third dimension to try and say, here are some things that we're not, in my view, attending to in the way that we should. I'm not going over the old ideas and evaluating them. I'm trying to suggest some new ideas. And I made in this paper that was published by the Center for New American Security and is available to you all online under this title of Poisonous Fruit, I made an effort to convey this, to convey recommendations. And I'm only going to talk about the first 6 recommendations in the context of today's talk, just to limit the time. And then we're going to have a panel to which I'm quite grateful for coming from out of town and struggling to get here. Have a panel, and I'll participate in that. You all are very welcome to ask questions, and the panelists will, I think, say some things about what they agree with and what they disagree with and what I've had to say. So I start with trying to establish a central point. I'm going to show you relatively few slides, but my first one is just to convey this central idea. This is the cover of that Center for New American Security report that I mentioned. And you see that I've introduced this metaphor of poisoned fruit and tried to make it quite visual here in this, I think, gripping graphic, but I always think whatever I present is gripping, and sometimes that may not seem so to you. It occurs to me this is literally gripping as well, so I can get out on those grounds. The central concept is that really the technologies that we're concerned with are inherently insecure, and that it's critical for policymakers to come to grips with that. And I'm going to try and explain briefly why it is that I think we're in that state, and then how we have to adapt to it. Before doing that, though, I want to suggest we need some kind of standard, some anvil against which to hammer out our ideas. And my standard in this context is a little different from anything that's come before. It's a national security standard, because I'm concerned with national security decision makers. Some various actors, including notably the Defense Science Board, a very distinguished body, say, well, we ought to be concerned not particularly with everyday cyber acts, ID theft and the like, but with risks that are essentially existential. Can a foreign government bring down American society in some fundamental way, alter the nature of our lives, and therefore pose a threat of dramatic proportions? My view is that that's not quite the right standard. It's not that I'm concerned with. Most nation states don't have a goal of destroying the United States. Their goal is a more modest one, I think, which is to alter our ability, our will to act. It is to imagine a situation where the US government is about to deploy forces abroad or do something like that, make some major decision about supporting an ally or protecting our interests, and the threat of cyber attack may be great enough that it undermines our ability to achieve that end. And therefore, from my standpoint, what I'm concerned about is this deterrent aspect, if you will, this undermining of our national security aspect. And the question I'm going to ask is, what are the circumstances and the causes of things that could put us in a situation where others could exert their will and we would be unable to exert ours because of cyber vulnerability? And I can distinguish in this context two quite different modes. One, an acute mode. Imagine that an opponent could subvert our cyber capabilities to the point where they could turn our missiles against ourselves, so that if you thought about firing them, they might in fact wind up at targets quite different from those we intended, perhaps our own cities or our own aircraft carriers or whatever. Or could they perhaps so fundamentally undermine our financial structure through cyber infiltration of stock markets and the like, that they undermine the trust in those and the fear of that consequence, or the fear of undermining our electrical grid in a way that would put it down for months, might then alter our will to do things. And then there's, besides this kind of acute concern, there's an endemic concern. Is the penetration of our cyber systems so great that over time it erodes our intellectual property and our economic strengths? So against that backdrop, that standard, that national security standard, which is different from the one which has dominated this debate, but which I think there's been a certain receptivity for since I articulated this over the summer, I want to ask ourselves, why is it that I say this risk is inherent in our systems, and why is it so great? And I'm just going to walk you briefly down. It's kind of hard to see the numbers here. The half dozen factors that I think are critical, and that'll lay the base then for some of the discussion about how we defend. A first characteristic of cyber capabilities that's hugely attractive to us is the way it concentrates information and power. So that when Jerry refers to our Navy integration of the Navy Marine Corps intranet, or when a utility creates a centralized system, or when documents are compiled through fundamental sharing of information, for example, across the intelligence community, it produces an enormous efficiency and a gain in effectiveness because we're able to access huge amounts of information. And you all appreciate this from your everyday use of the computer. But as in all the examples I'll give here, the virtue carries within it the seed of the vice, the seed of the vulnerability. So if you want to grasp this, just think about Snowden. We've had, over the course of history, many people like Snowden. Snowden is not unique in his motivations or attributes, or in his ability to extract from our system information that was intended to be kept classified and protected. What's striking about Snowden is that though we've had lots of people do these kinds of things, we've never had anybody who took 1.7 million documents. Snowden is empowered by the concentration we've created. And when Jerry speaks about concerns about, in essence, eggs in one basket, cyber systems intrinsically do that. Now we can limit that. We can, as major corporations do, create enclaves and say you can't get into this if you only have this level of privilege and the like. But notice what we're doing. We're giving up some measure of the virtue of the system in order to get greater protection. And this trade-off will occur all the time in these points. A second attribute is the quality of communication. You're well aware of it. The internet is the exemplary instance of it. Cyber systems are communicative, and when you realize that communication ultimately, whether it's oral or written, can be broken down into binary code, you realize that fundamentally these systems are essentially connected in order to gain power. And once you have that communicative capability, you introduce another aspect of vulnerability. George Tenet, then director of the CIA in 1998, had this wonderful comment. He, becoming aware of the nature of the world we're creating, he said, this is very dangerous because the enemy will be on our system routinely. And that perception is right. There are things you can do to limit the system, wall it out. In the optimal world, you create no communicativity. But here again, my basic point arises. You are trading off the virtue, sacrificing it, in order to buy security. And to the degree you indulge in the virtue, you benefit from it, you breed insecurity. The fruit is poisonous. It's also nutritious. And figuring out how to get the nutrition while limiting the effect of the poison is the fundamental task. Decision makers need to understand this. It implies that there is not a magic bullet, that there isn't a sort of amazing technical cure that I can have, because once I achieve concentration or communication, to the degree that I achieve it, I open myself up to vulnerability. Third is the inherent complexity of these systems. Thinking about how to describe this to decision makers, one of the old propositions in software writing is that for every 1,000 lines of code, there'll be, one can presume, a bug on average. A bug does not equal a vulnerability. This is not quite the same as a security problem, but that proposition gives you some sense of the difficulty of writing code that has accuracy and security at these kinds of levels, particularly when you stop to think about the size and complexity, ever-growing size and complexity of our software systems. Microsoft's operating system has 50 million lines of code. One error per 1,000 lines of code, you begin to see the level of possibilities. Again, I think decision makers tend to think, well, why can't these ne'er-do-wells, many of whom will be represented on the panel, we've selected some particularly striking ne'er-do-wells for the panel, why can't they write code that's just specific and accurate? And my analogy here to try and bridge the gap is think of the tax code. Our US government tax code is 4 million words, not 50 million lines, but 4 million words. Now granted, since I'm from Washington, I'm well aware, some people have incentives to write loopholes into the code, but put that aside. The reality is you cannot write a tax code that doesn't have loopholes. And all the efforts of well-willed people can't get over that because first, that tax code is interactive with all kinds of other things because the levels of complication are huge, because armies of lawyers and accountants are attempting to attack this and find economic and other benefit from doing so. And so it is with computer code. The level of complexity of the machinery is such that to actually write it in an accurate way in the face of the expected onslaught and attack is an extremely difficult thing to do. And that's compounded by this fourth factor, which is extensibility and temporality. The tax code's complication arises in part because it has to work with the business code. And the federal tax code has to work with the state and local tax codes and the estate taxes and the like. And the interaction of these effects hugely adds to the complication. In the cyber world, that's a vastly greater problem. The 50 million lines of Microsoft operating system have to also work with Adobe, have to work with other systems in order to work. And that's a great complication. Moreover, these systems have histories. And you can't just junk that history when you think of some improved way of dealing with things, because in fact, the way they operated in the past has generated dependencies, particular software uses that users depend on and continuing, and they need to crosswalk from their old systems to their new systems. And even if you could come up with some system that somehow or another penetrated the complexity and penetrated the problems of interaction and extensibility, you would still have the problem that all future systems that are going to be developed will introduce new complications you can't ever test at the origin point. Further, there's the flexibility of the system. The incredibly wonderful thing about the computer, the PC as you use it, is that it can do so many different things. It is such a plastic and agile instrument. But that very plasticity and agility enables people to misuse it as well as it enables you to use it. Again, the virtue causes the limitation. In one online blog, one commentator observed, when people say, well, we ought to regulate the computer or the cyber world, the digital world, in ways that would not enable it to do bad, it's sort of analogous to saying, well, we'll regulate automobiles because automobiles are used in bank thefts and bank robberies. The tool is simply too useful, too dexterous, too mainline to admit of the kinds of controls that might restrict its capability, except insofar as you sacrifice its virtues. Saying no cars can, now this is me, not the online guy, no cars can drive around in the vicinity of banks. Okay, I can reduce automobile use for robbing banks. I can reduce computer use, but the costs are obvious and the challenges are very great. And finally, there is a senior computer scientist at Microsoft who coined the term disintermediation. I kind of like the term. What he was observing is something that you all have observed, which is one of the virtues of the digitization of so many of our services is that they remove intermediaries between you and the data. So when you want to book a table at the many elite restaurants that have been spawned around this university, or when you want to travel and book an airline reservation, you don't need to work through the reservation assistant or the clerk. You go online and there's no person inserted between you and the data you want to enter or manipulate. The problem is that in doing that, we've removed the security gatekeepers. So Snowden has direct access and the like. This has a really fundamental effect on our security in these situations. NSA responds to Snowden in part by saying, we'll introduce a two-person rule, perfectly sensible. You want to download certain kinds of information, you have to do it not only on your own password, but also with someone else agreeing to you. But look at what's happening. You're sacrificing the power of the computer to enable you to work one-on-one, and you're introducing a second person into it. So I've spent some time on this just to try and emphasize fundamentally, in my view, in the software world, your ability to gain virtues and strength is intimately intertwined with the vulnerabilities that you acquire. Now, there are risks outside the software as well. Obviously, as Snowden reminds us, insiders can subvert the system quite apart from software complexity. Manning doesn't, in his WikiLeaks or Snowden in his efforts, they don't subvert the system in the sense that the system has vulnerabilities in the software. They just use their privileges to subvert the system. And there are a very large number of people in systems thought to be isolated that actually have access to those systems, third parties and contractors, et cetera. The press reports about Stuxnet, the undermining of the centrifuges in Iran, suggest that one of the potential sources of entry to those systems, which were isolated from the internet, which had no communicativity in that respect, may have been contractors who came in and connected their laptops or whatever to the system. There's also the well-known phenomenon of social engineering. If you haven't had occasion to read any of Mitnick's books, I recommend that you read one. You don't have to read more than one. Mitnick, out there hacking as a teenager, eventually becomes big time enough, enter to cyber systems that what he does is winds up in prison. He comes out of federal prison and starts to write books, a well-known alternative to prison sentences. What he does is to recount analytically how he fools people in giving him information. And if you like, in the Q&A, I can give you an example or two. Let me say, I think of myself as quite a sophisticated user of these kinds of things. Quite clear to me I'd fall for some of Mitnick's maneuvers. They're just so well constructed in that regard. So people are very subject to this kind of manipulation, which places outsiders in privileged positions. The story of mismanagement of passwords and the like is well known. We can come back to it later if you'd like. I just want to emphasize that besides all of these software problems and people problems, there are also hardware problems, supply chain problems. And in trying to bring those home to decision makers, what are we talking about here? I decided to do a little bit of research, and the question I put to myself was, how many transistors are manufactured every second worldwide in the modern economy? Now, this audience is more sophisticated than policymakers. I very much hope you are. And more sophisticated than many I would talk with. Just think about that answer. As you understand, the transistor is invented 60 years ago, or commercially adapted 60 years ago, marketed by TI, Texas Instruments, almost exactly 60 years to the day of this talk. And it becomes the guts of our modern systems, your cell phone and the like. And Moore's law, widely appreciated, suggests that every 18 months or so, there'll be a doubling of the number of transistors we can put on a chip, a reduction in price and size, et cetera. So my question is a simple one. How many get produced in that amount of time? So I came up with a number which seems so strange that it was very disorienting to me. And eventually I managed to get some friends at Intel, the great entity working in this arena, to allocate some energies from the Intel research department to work on this. And they spent a considerable amount of time, came up with a number which was so disorienting to them and me that we then spent some hours together on the phone. And eventually we came up with an agreed number. So just think in your head what your number is, and think how policymakers would envision this. Here's how many transistors were just manufactured in that amount of time. So there are 8 trillion transistors manufactured every second worldwide, as best Intel and secondarily I can estimate it. And the only reason I engage in this is I don't believe that decision makers and policymakers, when they talk about Moore's law and about hardware, have any real grasp of the magnitude of the challenge. Tracking items that go into our major systems, and you could use other items as a surrogate. This is merely suggestive. I want to just mention one last consideration, which is speed of change and the difficulty here. I suggested at the outset when I talked about digital immigrants versus digital natives. Here my analogy is back to 1300 and the introduction of gunpowder, more or less around that time, into Europe. What's so striking about gunpowder is that it changes everything. It changes our notions clearly of warfare. Can't have defensive systems which are just straight walls and in moats and forts because the gunpowder eviscerates that. It changes our notion of militaries because now mass really matters and training matters. You can't just conscript a batch of people from the local surf arena. It changes our notions of leadership and chivalry because no longer does it make any sense to be out on the front lines waving your sword. You'll be shot and you'll be dead. You need to be back behind the lines, and a lot of what you do is scientific in some ways. It's understanding at least something about ballistics and so forth. So our notions of the officer corps changed. Our notions of the state changed because if you have a munitions industry, you become a vastly more powerful state. But to do that, you have to have interactions of the state with the economy. We begin to get taxation, et cetera. You're not here to hear me talk about the 1300s and the 1400s, though I would like to go on. But my only point in offering the analogy is that all the changes that I just described took place over the course of 2 centuries. The information revolution, the arrival of digital systems, is not less powerful or significant for warfare or other means of the organization of the state than gunpowder. But all the changes that we've experienced have occurred over the last 2 decades, more or less. So what took 2 centuries now takes 2 decades. Is it any wonder that there's lag in comprehension about this, that our regulatory systems lag and the like? We have huge problems in identifying our sources of expertise. One of the reasons I applaud the program here is because you're trying to develop some sense of the science, some sense of the order. We don't have the kind of infrastructure that we have in other areas. Paula mentioned that I was very engaged. Jerry mentioned this as well. I liked your example, Jerry. I think it was that peppermint spray, the only example that I can think of where I actually, something I was doing, disseminated throughout the whole Pentagon. But the striking thing in the biology is we have peer-reviewed journals, we have a sense of the underlying science, we have a sense of who the leaders are in a credentialing system. They share a common understanding. We don't have that to the same extent at all in cybersecurity. Much of the literature that I footnote, and I went at pains to write very extensive footnotes in this paper, comes from online sources that are not peer-reviewed and from talking to people. So those are our challenges. I'm not going to go through the whole series of defensive efforts in this regard. They're probably familiar to a number of people here and watching online. Suffice it to very quickly say, we started with notions of we'll create barriers like physical barriers, the kind of analogy to my gunpowder walls and moats. That didn't work. People could get through it too readily. We thought we'd circulate antiviral software, which would recognize previous signatures of attackers and lead us in a position in which we could screen out whatever used those signatures. Antiviral software tends to lag on the order of 55 to 60 days on average after attacks, so you have long periods of attack. People don't download it. Then some smart people came along and started pointing out all the vulnerabilities in antiviral software, which has huge levels of privilege in order to be able to investigate the entire machine. So if you attack the antiviral software, you're gaining a wonderful entree to software systems. We moved more systematically to searches for vulnerabilities. Let's review the software through systems like Microsoft Sage and quickly, through random testing and other mechanisms, discover vulnerabilities. That sharply reduced the number of vulnerabilities, the ease of discovering them, but it by no means eliminated them. It just meant that you had to make more effort if you were on the outside. I managed to get access to some data from some companies that professionally search for vulnerabilities, and what I found was that it used to take about half a man-year on average to find a major vulnerability in a major system. That was their operating metric. Now it takes about 2 years on average, 2 man-years, to find, I'm sorry, Paula, 2 person years, to find such a vulnerability. But it's still being found, and I'll show you in a moment. We moved to systems of active defense and defense in depth, but as you're seeing through the headlines each day, we still have rather porous systems. The existence of these vulnerabilities is suggested by a market. Everybody out there is paying for them, or a number of entities are paying for them. If you can find, in my 5th line down, vulnerability in Microsoft Word that's substantial, Microsoft will pay you in 2012, according to Forbes, $50,000 to $100,000. You can go online and find out what each of these major companies is offering for your keys in regard to them. So what do you do about this? And I want just quickly to make a half dozen suggestions. The first is, if you buy the proposition that I started with, that the vulnerabilities are inherent in the virtues, that the limitations here and the liabilities are a consequence of the strengths, you want to be thinking more than we have been thinking about limiting those strengths, generating what I would call lean systems. Snowden copies 1.7 million documents. I understand why Snowden, as a systems administrator, might have access to 1.7 million documents. I don't understand why he can copy them. It's because the system I've set up has a copying capability. Now, it may have been disabled on the particular machine or whatever, but with a screwdriver and a little ingenuity, because the machine is a basic machine, he apparently has the ability to retrieve that capability. In your own life, think about your printer. You're buying a huge set of capabilities. Most of you are only using one or two. What are you using? You're using your printer to print. Very subtle insight here. I'm from Washington here to tell you this. You're using the computer, the printer perhaps as a fax machine. But the printer also has other attributes, for example, memory. And it's got a memory capability that will keep track of what you did for long periods of time. Why do you buy that attribute in the machine? Well, because that's the way the machine came to you. But that additional capability opens up fundamental vulnerabilities for you. Anybody who can gain access to that memory now has a lot of information about everything you printed over time. Did you want it? No. Did you think about it? No. That's just a small example in miniature of what we do. Equally fundamentally, maybe even more fundamentally, I'm very much recommend the creation of out-of-band systems. What do we mean by that? We mean systems that are not digital, so that you merge your digital system with another kind of attribute, which is analog or physical or human, so that the system, if subverted digitally, has a second barrier to get over. If I really care about something, as for example my command and control systems, or my nuclear systems, or maybe my bank account, I want some requirement, not just that there be a digital input, but that there be some human input or other kind of secondary consideration. If I have a physical alarm or a physical switch that needs to be changed on my power grid or other kinds of data or systems, it gives me an ability to protect those systems, which is not simply dependent on the digital world. I also want separation of those systems to the extent it makes sense. Enclaves and so on make sense. Isolation from the internet and other sources makes sense. And I want some system of resilience. If I recognize the inherent insecurity of the system, I very much want to create modes of failure that are more graceful and less catastrophic. Now, actually working this out is challenging, and we can talk some about it, but it's fundamental way of thinking which does not now exist. And I think we need to put this in the context as well of private sector. I understand all the tensions about regulation of the private sector in these arenas, but if we recognize that key entities like airlines need to be regulated because of their safety, how can we not recognize that if there is the potential for catastrophic effect at the level talked about by my national security standard, by a financial or other kind of difficulty, we have reasons as a government to reach out to them. We recognize that the notion of too big to fail applies in the financial arena. It applies as well, in my opinion, in the cyber arena. It doesn't make me necessarily a fan of regulation. If we can achieve this by incentives or by persuasion, it's much better. And if we regulate, we have to recognize the speed of change that I've talked about and argue that we need to regulate by focus on the outcomes, not focus on the inputs, because the inputs will change all the time as the industry changes. There's an interesting report which maybe Andy Osmond, a member of the panel, will comment on, because it comes out of an office that works for him, which has been classified and therefore can't be talked about in its particulars, but its bottom line has been public, which is that the government has tried to assess which are the key industries that have this kind of degree of dependence. And anything you can do in the panel discussion to get Andy to violate the security laws, I think will be admirable. I'd suggest if any of you have wine, I've found that to be a very useful interrogation technique. The third recommendation is we need to disaggregate the problem. You have very different concepts of cybersecurity in, for example, the finance industry and in the power industry. In my report, I observed the finance industry recognizes that cyber problems are fundamental to them. Their cyber assets are what they have. It's all digits that they work with all the time. In the power industry, by contrast, physical assets are hugely important, and their physical assets are endangered. There's instances of bombing and the like of transformers and entities, power stations, and consequence is the finance people focus on their cyber assets above all. The power industry people do not have that attitude. The finance people are used to being attacked and respond very quickly with the most modern software. Their financial resources are very large and very fluid. They put large amounts of money into their problems. They understand their problems better than the government does. They want certain things from the government, but they tend not to be basic information about the nature of the vulnerability of their system. The power industry, by contrast, with its physical focus, also is regulated, has difficulty implementing new systems, has an annual downtime for maintenance, and is used to making changes once a year, not once every 10 minutes, as the cyber world begins to demand, or faster. It has a regulatory capital base, so that if they do invest in cybersecurity, they have to go to their authorities, their regulatory authorities, and get their situation improved. Very different worlds that we're looking at. This makes me think we don't want a cyber czar who controls everything with one size fits all. We need to move each individual cabinet department to working with its relevant industries, Department of Energy with energy companies, Treasury with those companies involved in finance, FCC and other agencies with the internet service providers, and recognize that this is a general problem to which there's a general approach, and I've articulated what I think that ought to be, inherent risk, et cetera, but the applications of that approach are quite different in different areas. Fourth, I think we need a lot more of the behavioral, anthropological, if you will, kinds of studies that pay attention to economics, that pay attention to what it is that animates hackers and others. One of our panelists, Stefan Savage, professor at San Diego, has done exemplary work in this area. There are too few people doing the kinds of things that Stefan does. One small example from my standpoint is I feel as though we have a very limited understanding of the incentives for PLA hackers in China who are penetrating our systems, collecting IP. If I conclude that, by and large, they're working at the direction of the state, closely supervised, and I have some sense of their workflows, I may be able to use deterrent mechanisms in one way rather effectively. If, on the other hand, they're freelancing and selling on their side, which is a plausible hypothesis given well-known patterns of corruption in China and the like, I have a wholly different model. Similarly with Russia and other countries. What is the reality of that world? I don't think we understand it. And I don't think we understand ourselves. We don't understand well what the incentives are for companies so that various companies, you see this illustrated with Sony and Target and the like, are not as well defended as they might be. We need to stop simply preaching and begin to understand the world from their perspective. I've sketched two different perspectives, finance and power, to suggest something about why this kind of research would uncover very fundamental differences that we need to attend to. Fifth, we need some sharing of information in a better way than now exists. And the way I suggest doing this in my paper is to take the example of near misses in aviation. The FAA regulates accident investigation, but it doesn't regulate collection of information about near misses in aircraft, but it's very informative. Every company has an incentive not to reveal its information. They don't want it known that they just had a near miss, for obvious reasons. But then it turns out that if we share that information, we can greatly improve airline safety. So some smart people working with MITRE, federally financed research development center, worked out a system where they provided information on an anonymized basis to that contractor. That contractor then scrubbed it and shared it with other participating companies and with the government. The board that oversaw this consisted largely of private sector participants, but also some FAA participants. And the system in the beginning only had 2 or 3 airlines participating. Now it has nearly 100% of American airlines working and is spreading internationally. We need something like that to build up our data. Finally, I just want to talk for a minute about the foreign policy applications of this. As you know, we have adopted a more controversial, more confrontational attitude towards China and Russia and their intrusions on our system. I think that may be a useful thing to do. Its usefulness, though, is likely to be limited. Remember, what I'm interested in doing in this is suggesting new areas where there's been too little attention. And the area that I think is striking in this regard is that there is apparently an implicit area of agreement between us and the Chinese or the Russians. There is a capability, and one of the panelists, Ralph Langner, is the sort of global authority on this subject, to move from cyber attacks to cyber physical attacks, to not just steal data, as we're alleging the Chinese do, but also to move beyond that and destroy the power grid or destroy physical facilities, attack airplanes and the like, satellites, you name it. What's striking is, amidst all the fuss and the confrontation, we apparently do not do this to the Chinese or the Russians, and they apparently do not do it to us. Now, you may say, well, leave well enough alone. But this norm is fragile. We know that somebody is engaged probably with the Iranians against them, or the Iranians are engaged against others, in cyber physical attacks. Stuxnet was a cyber physical attack. So it's as though we had some norm of we won't engage in thermonuclear war while thermonuclear war is occurring in some other jurisdiction. It's not a solid, robust norm, it's a fragile one. What we found in the nuclear arena was that when we had such norms, if we could begin to talk about them, build confidence in them, understand each other's what we called red lines, things we weren't going to do, it was extremely beneficial to draw such restrictions out. Or as a different example and a final one, we have had deterrence for the last decades resting on a theory which, simply put, was, as you're familiar with it, a theory of MAD, mutually assured destruction. And the theory is, it is in our interest for the Chinese or the Russians to have second strike capabilities, because that way they won't feel that they have to strike first so as to destroy our nuclear arsenals, because if we struck and they didn't have those second strike capabilities, they'd lose. If they have the second strike capabilities, they can respond and come back to us. That's a good notion. Well, I've just described to you the inherent insecurity associated with cyber systems. If those cyber systems are the basis of our nuclear command and control, do we really have, in second strike capabilities, mutually assured destruction? Or, I suggest in my paper, we're moving from a world of mutually assured destruction to a world of mutually unassured destruction. A movement from a world of MAD to a movement to a world of MUD. And that world of MUD is, as the metaphor notes, the acronym suggests, inherently unstable. The implication of this, besides my major achievement in doing what every Pentagon person wants to do most, which is make up a new acronym, the implication of this is fundamental, though. It is not in our interest to penetrate the Chinese nuclear command control arsenal, and it is not in their interest to penetrate ours, because to do this is fundamentally to undercut second strike security and to move us away from mutually assured destruction, which is in our interest. Therefore, we and the Chinese and the Russians ought to have some common interest in trying to negotiate some norms that exclude this kind of attack. And since this kind of attack is also, since in the cyber world one of the challenges is that intelligence probes are largely indistinguishable from laying the basis for attack probes. Whatever penetration you achieve just for looking around can also be used for destroying. We would want to limit those kinds of things too. These are areas, the cyber physical and the MAD-MUD proposition, these are areas which need more attention and which are very fundamental but haven't yet appeared on the radar for discussion. So I've tried to suggest a conceptual framework. I've tried to figure out how to articulate it to the laymen and policymakers, and I've tried to articulate some operational consequences of, if you believe the conceptual propositions, here are some things you ought to do that we're not now doing. There are other recommendations in the paper, but I think the single most valuable thing I can do for you now is to stop talking and bring on the panelists. So thank you very much.
Once again, I want to thank Richard Danzig for his wonderful presentation, and hope all of you took advantage of the input he's provided, and ponder and come up with some interesting questions. It's now my pleasure to introduce the distinguished panelists. We have Ralph Langner. He's the director and founder of Langner Communications. Ralph's expertise lies in his knowledge of protecting major infrastructure from cyber threats, including power, water treatment, food and beverage, and the automotive industries, to name a few. He has served as an advisor to the Senate Homeland Security Committee, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the White House. He holds a psychology degree from the Free University in Berlin. The next panelist is Andy Osment. He is the Assistant Secretary in the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. His group's task is to enhance the security, resiliency, and reliability of the nation's cyber and communications network. He has previously served as the White House Senior Director of Cybersecurity. He earned his bachelor's from Georgia Tech, his master's from the London School of Economics, and his PhD in computer science from the University of Cambridge, a hotbed for cybersecurity research. Stefan Savage is a computer science and engineering professor and director of the Center for Network Systems at the University of California, San Diego, my alma mater. He is a leading researcher on the economic and social structure of internet-based crime, and the crux of his research lies in the intersection of distributed systems, networking, and computer security. He has been a recipient of the Weiser Award and is a Sloan Fellow. By the way, let me also give a quick explanation of the Weiser Award. It was created in 2001 by the ACM Special Interest Group on Operating Systems to be given to an individual who has demonstrated creativity and innovation in operating systems research. That's Stefan. He earned his BS at Carnegie Mellon and his PhD from the University of Washington. And he's a New Yorker. He went to high school right here in New York. With that, I'll kick off the panel. Do you want to start with a summary, or we can ask questions? Whichever you want.
Summary of what?
Of the importance of cybersecurity in the context of cyber physical systems.
Okay, I'm not going to do that general awareness raising talk here, because I'm confident that you have heard that every so often. I don't need to repeat that. But probably what I would like to do is to put Richard's paper into context and to explain why I like his paper and supported him in the course of writing that paper. You cannot miss to realize that it contains a bunch of new ideas. So just think about what is not in the paper. Like, it's not talking about deterrence to a great detail. It's completely different from the US cyber strategy, from publications of the Department of Defense, where you basically learn, okay, if the United States experiences a major cyber attack that is equivalent in the consequence to a kinetic attack, then the US reserves the right to use kinetic force to strike back. It is also very different from what you have read from, let's just say, the Department of Homeland Security, so the defensive side of the government that deals with the private sector. What you don't read in the paper in great detail.
Although let me quickly interrupt and say what you read from the Department of Homeland Security is great stuff.
Certainly.
Sorry.
However, this is, I don't think you're making the point that it's not great stuff, which is in Richard's paper. So what you're not reading to great detail is public-private partnership. It's just a minor topic. You're not reading about information sharing. You're not reading about risk management. Instead, what I think is striking, Richard's original audience is the government, or the administration, to be more specific. And he starts with raising a very substantial point that hadn't been discussed before, which simply is, where do we draw the red line? So rather than what you would read in the Executive Order 13636, for example, well, we have to raise the security posture, but to which extent? And Richard approaches the problem from a different angle. He raises the question, where do we have to draw a red line? He doesn't tell where he draws the red line. He just poses that we need to discuss that. We should have an idea what that red line is. It leads Richard to some kind of a minimalistic standard, which in a way makes me feel sorry and unhappy, because I would actually like to see more than just arriving at that minimum security posture. And the suggestions that you find in the paper, they're not about, as I said, risk management, etc., but his ideas on how to arrive at a proactive, passive defense. This is why I believe his paper needs a lot of attention and really comes up with some fresh ideas that you didn't hear before.
So I have a couple of questions for Andy there. So one of them was indirectly posed by Richard. Maybe you won't reveal this. What are the key industries? And the more substantive question is public-private partnerships. We talk about them a lot, but are they happening? And if not, why are they not happening?
Sure. So let me take those in turn. What are the key ministries or departments in the United States government, is how we'd phrase it, with respect to cybersecurity? And I think Richard's point on this was exactly right. Speak up. All right. Is this any better? Can folks hear me in the back? Okay. So the question is, what are the key departments in the United States government? And I think Richard was exactly right about this. 10 years ago, I think there was a strong desire in the government to find the center of cybersecurity for the government. And some of that, I think, derived from the sense of this as a boundable problem. And some of that, I think, derived from the sense that when people of a computer science or technical background like myself approach the problem, that's sort of naturally how we think about it. I think what we've learned over the last 4 or 5 years is we were thinking about it the wrong way. The reality is, this is the problem of the 21st century. Cybersecurity and cyberspace touch everything that we do, and every agency in the government is dealing with the world it faces, moving to cyberspace, and consequently, they all have to deal with cybersecurity. And one of Richard's points that I think is exactly on point is that you need domain knowledge. It's not enough to be a cybersecurity expert. You need to apply cybersecurity expertise to the specific problems of the financial sector, the energy sector, you name it. And so I think what you see over the last 4 or 5 years, and particularly in the release of Executive Order 13636, this realization that, in fact, we have to have all of the government involved. And so departments and agencies that had not thought of themselves as having a role in cybersecurity, maybe the Environmental Protection Agency, you name it, have come to the realization that, in fact, they do have a role, and they have a quite important role in cybersecurity. Now, a quick shameless plug for the Department of Homeland Security. I left the White House for the Department of Homeland Security particularly because I think DHS, Homeland Security, DHS's mission is crucial. We are, for the protection of the private sector, in some sense the glue between all of these different agencies like the Department of Energy, the Department of Treasury, that have that expertise in their particular sector. And so we try to do many things in this space to include changing the broader behavior of the market so that cybersecurity is built in to technologies when you buy them rather than being an afterthought. To include helping industry understand what are the best practices that they can and should adopt, and to include information sharing. Now, the other question you raised, I think, is a really good one, and Ralph alluded to this as well, which is, honestly, the government has been talking about public-private partnerships significantly in this space since at least 1998. If you've been in this space at all, you are very tired of hearing that phrase. Just like information sharing, when you use only the phrase information sharing or only the phrase public-private partnerships, you are confusing more than you are clarifying. And that's because ultimately it's about for what? Information sharing for what? Public-private partnerships for what? And when you get to the for what, then you start to have a useful conversation. So if you talk about public-private partnerships in the abstract, I've got nothing useful to say. What I can tell you is that for particular problem areas or in particular spaces, we are having great partnerships between the public and the private sector. The financial services sector is particularly attuned to the threats that they face, and they're reaching out and saying, all right, government, let's work on some concrete things that we can do to be more effective, and we're working with them on that today. It's let's work with our Information Sharing and Analysis Center, our ISAC for the financial services sector, and work with the Department of Homeland Security, share information about tactical threat indicators in near real time from computer to computer. So rather than emailing each other encrypted files that are comma-separated files of bad IP addresses, let's have our computers talk directly to each other rapidly and say, hey, this IP address is part of a denial of service attack. Talk to your ISP about it, or put this IP address into your firewall. That's a very concrete example of a public-private partnership and a very concrete example of information sharing that are super valuable. And we're doing that with every different sector, with lots of different companies that matter, and that is what real public-private partnership is about.
The problem is solved.
Oh, we're done. We're going home.
Yeah. So I'll ask one or two more questions, and if you have questions, please raise your hand, and the mics are around. And there are a few more questions. Those who are online, please send us a few more questions, and I'll take some of those questions as well. So one of the recommendations that Richard has was about investing in the social sciences, and he actually mentioned some of the work that Stefan has done in this area. So Stefan, could you elaborate a little bit and what's missing?
Sure. So I'll talk a little bit about my own experience. I got my undergrad degree in history and then switched to computer science and found myself in security somewhat by accident, but worked in that field actually in a fairly traditional capacity for 5 or 6 years, looking at technical problems and coming up with technical defenses, the bread and butter of the security industry. And I think the conclusion that we came to after doing this for 5 or 6 years is that we were simultaneously successful by all the metrics that we had. We published papers, we spun out companies, we did this, and yet we were all less secure. And one of the realizations that we had was that the mistake was looking at this entirely as a technical problem. So we are, for whatever reason, in the cyber realm, we really have a certain arrogance that, well, we built the thing with our hands, it's mechanistic, we can make proofs about how it's supposed to work, that we should be able to solve it entirely in that same mathematical mindset. And the reality is that the security part in cyber is about conflict. And no one ever comes and says, well, we have a proof for why we're not going to have war anymore. And yet, in the cyber realm, there's this expectation that we'll be able to solve it purely through some technical intermediation that will then render all attacks impossible. And the reality is that the computer systems are the medium through which this conflict is being expressed. But it's pretty important to understand what are the underlying incentives for the conflict, because that's what limits the space that you have to focus on. You can spend all day looking for every single vulnerability that could exist and every threat that possibly could happen, and you're very unlikely to make significant progress. In order, though, to limit yourself to the ones that are likely to happen, you actually need to understand your adversary. And so we've done, in some domains where we have a fair amount of insight on the economically motivated cybercrime side, been able to get to the point where we can say, well, actually, we understand the entire value structure and supply chain of our adversary, and then go about and say, well, what investments in going after them make sense, and which ones actually are secondary. And so this is the place where I think there's a lot less thought. We tend to focus on, well, there's a bug in this power system, there's a bug in this thing, and not, well, who's going to attack us and why, and what are all the things they would need to do, and what are the most cost-effective ways to get in their way.
So I think the thing that concerns me about the absolutely right prescription that in different ways all three of you subscribe to, and I do too, about what Andy calls cross-domain expertise in the context of the industry regulation, or you're demanding this social science skill to go with the cyber skill in your comments, Stefan, or your concerns, Ralph, about cyber physical. You need to understand the physical world and the cyber world. All these point to workforce problems. We're asking people to be not just fluent in the cyber world, a huge challenge, but asking them to be fundamentally bilingual. And I wonder to what extent, and this comes back in part to Paula's observations about workforce, to what extent you're seeing that capability, for example, in the US government, Andy.
So first of all, you're exactly right. There's a huge workforce challenge. So if you are a student in this room and you are not in the field of cybersecurity, let me urge you to change that immediately and get into the field of cybersecurity. And then while you do that, to follow Stefan's point, don't just study cybersecurity. Take those classes in other domains that will give you some broader context. You know, I see enormous improvement in the US government where we are cross-training people. And I'll tell you, I shared some of the hubris that Stefan talked about when I came to government. I said, listen, you can't really contribute to this field unless you start off in cybersecurity. Boy, was I wrong. We have amazing people doing amazing work who had no background in cybersecurity and still don't have great cybersecurity expertise. And so that's a huge step forward for us, is we can take a person who knows a lot about the energy sector, help them come up to speed with enough on cybersecurity that they can make a key contribution there. Nonetheless, the pipeline of talent is an enormous problem for us. We're tackling it in lots of different ways. We're supporting competitions. So you in the audience, I hope, have heard about some of the cyber competitions there are, sort of capture the flag competitions, you name it. We're supporting it through the Centers of Academic Excellence. So Department of Homeland Security and the National Security Agency both work together to recognize centers of academic excellence in the US that are universities who have a curriculum in cybersecurity that meets certain standards. But we can and should be doing more. And I would look to you in the audience and say that you can and should be doing more too. This is a problem that we can only solve working together.
Well, I tend to disagree about the idea that the US government would have insignificant or not enough cybersecurity expertise, because we do see a lot of expertise on the offensive side. And this basically reflects one topic that Richard brings up in the paper, which is the unbalanced nature of the capabilities. So I would say, if you want to make a career in cybersecurity, well, do that, and you will find good money in the offensive business. When you're talking about defense, that's a completely different story. And certainly we could reflect on the enormous personal, intellectual capacity that is required to work in that field. It might make me feel better. However, I don't think that this is actually the real issue here. What I think, it's much more simple, and it was mentioned even in the introduction to the talk. Well, you have to put cash on the table. The simple fact of the matter is, if you want to excel on the defensive part of cybersecurity, all you have to collect a lot of different areas of expertise. You have to become proficient in so many different areas. Why would you do that, realizing that for a defensive job, no matter if you're thinking about government or the private sector, you are guaranteed to make less money than any lawyer, dentist, you name it. Unless we change this, I don't see much reason to lament about the sorry state of the workforce.
Well, go ahead.
So let me disagree on a couple of points. I think the dentist versus cybersecurity expert is maybe a false dichotomy. I think the people who are going into engineering, who are driven by this, are not choosing between dentistry and cyber. And I think within the engineering and the sciences, for those of you who are students, the only thing, I graduate students every year, and they have more jobs being thrown at them than they can deal with. The only thing aside from security you can put on your resume as an engineer that is in the same ballpark as far as generating jobs as data scientists, right? Security and data scientist are the two things as an engineer that will guarantee you tons of employment opportunities. I would say that in the government sector, it is harder to hire some of these people because you can't pay commensurately. Cybersecurity is everyone's problem, and the private sector is compensating people according to market rates. And aside from the special dispensation that NSA has, the public sector by and large cannot pay what the private sector can, which is why a lot of the best people come in as contractors. I also I would disagree that the offensive people by and large get paid better. That has not been my experience. The startups that I know in the offensive space, actually this is a challenging domain for them. As an individual, if you are a uniquely talented vulnerability researcher, sure, but that's not the bread and butter of the workforce. I think there's a lot of money available in the private sector for very good people. I think a challenge is we are not training enough of them. I could take my entire graduating class and have every year and have Google hire all of them in perpetuity, and that's clear that that's an issue. There's far more demand for these people than there is a supply being generated.
Go ahead.
I was just going to jump in and say, I think I heard a plug from Ralph that my department get more budget as somewhere lurked in there, so I'm going to foot stomp that. The other thing I do want to flag, though, is like literally right now in the waning days of this Congress, there is a bill in front of the Congress that would give the Department of Homeland Security, the defensive side, the same ability to hire more flexibly that the Department of Defense already has. And I think that would be an incredible benefit to us and sort of points to some of the just historical strengths that the Department of Defense has been given and accumulated over time that I do think that it would benefit the nation greatly if the Department of Homeland Security also had.
So Andy, I think you're right on about that, and in the paper I particularly single out that step as one that I think would be useful in workforce hiring authorities. But Ralph also made a sort of larger point. In the paper, the way I express it is to say that the government strikes me as lopsided. It's got great muscularity on what Ralph is calling the offensive side and less or so on the defensive side. And as a result, it kind of walks with a limp when it works in this area. Does that seem to you to be right? Does the basic point that Ralph's making in that regard ring true to you?
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. Part of it is what we tend to think of as the offensive side. One has a longer historical mission. So, the NSA, which does signals intelligence, has been doing that a long time, and it turns out that in the 21st century, a lot of the same skill sets that applied in the signals intelligence realm apply in cybersecurity. Part of it is that the government's defensive workforce is distributed in a way that workforce concentrated the NSA is not. Every department has a chief information security officer. They all have cyber defenders on that workforce. So I think there's two things going on. One is the distributed nature of this, and the other is historically there's just been more of a mission in that signals intelligence side over a longer period of time. So I absolutely think we need to focus on growing our cyber defensive mission in the government, and I see that every year in increasing budgets on that cybersecurity defensive mission side. So I think we're doing it. I would love to do it faster. And I think some of the things that we've just talked about, the workforce, more budget for the would all help with that.
So we have a,
why not discuss that?
I think we have a few more questions. Maybe we should take a different question and go around, discuss around that. So this is from Jerry. So much of what DHS says on cyber seems elementary. Will we now see a tougher, Danzig-like approach?
So we have a large customer set, and I'll tell you, when I came to Department of Homeland Security, in my office, I'm trying to change our language to use the term customer, because our job in my office is really about leaving our customers more secure today than they were yesterday. And those customers are the federal executive branch, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, and the private sector. And I'll tell you, you look across that and you have, just to look at the private sector, you have important power plants that are, very small, couple hundred people companies at best, who buy, essentially commercial technology to run that power plant, don't have a strong IT workforce. And then you have super sophisticated multinational corporations with 24/7 security operations centers staffed with dozens of people. And you look across that enormous breadth, and we have to serve all of those populations. In some ways, our national risk may be more concentrated on the less sophisticated side of those operations than it is on the more sophisticated side. The things that I can do to help a sophisticated company really are more on that just sheer partnership and exchanging of information than they are when I look at that less sophisticated company where I have to help them reach a point where they can continue to run their network with 2 people, none of whom is a cyber expert, and have security built in, because the economics of their environment aren't going to change such that they can suddenly have a 24/7 security operations center. So if you're in the field of cybersecurity, a lot of what we're preaching will sound extraordinarily basic to you. It is extraordinarily basic. We as a nation are not at a point where we have done the extraordinarily basic things.
So second question to Ralph, again from the online audience. If any of you have a question, please raise your hand. Maybe I'll take this question and then we'll follow up with some of you. So Semantic seems to have become an expert on Stuxnet, and this is post facto. Why haven't they shared this information with Semantic, or have they? Before
Say again, I didn't get
Semantic has become an expert in Stuxnet, is what he says, right? Because they figured out that there were problems, they uncovered the Stuxnet to some extent. If they why did they wait until the attack happened? Couldn't they have figured it out a priori, or did they not share the data a priori?
I think there is a misconception involved here. Symantec didn't realize what was going on before the fact.
I think just to put a point on that, for the people in the audience who don't recognize this, there is far more malware out there than any set of companies has the resources to analyze. Right? We're talking hundreds of thousands of distinct kinds of malware, and we undoubtedly will, over time, discover that some of these things that we've had in our files were very sophisticated operations that no one knew about. But there is now so much that there is no reasonable way to go and look at all of it. And so you try to triage.
I would like to jump into that argument, because I don't want to make you feel kind of hopeless, like all is lost because there is this ocean of malware. So let's focus on what we call the critical infrastructure with power generation and distribution, chemical plants, etc. Basically, in this small but important domain, not all hope is lost, because we don't need to analyze millions of samples of malware. What we really need to do is to analyze promising cyber-physical attack vectors. And that is actually much easier than you would think. Because on the physical side, so in a cyber-physical attack, which involves the physical, the process part and the equipment, we have low entropy. We don't have high complexity. Let me give you an example. The process, the process of generating power is about boiling water. There are not millions of ways how you could mess up this process. So again, not all hope is lost, and in this part of the universe, this small interesting part, we are actually not that much reverse engineering existing malware, etc. We are much more interested in identifying promising cyber-physical attack vectors.
So, one question right behind Jerry.
Thank you. Bob Gezelter, Richard mentioned the comment about will to interact at the beginning of your introduction, way back when. I submit that the problem is not will, but ability. The weak knee of all response, whether it's government or corporate, is logistics. If you can impede the deployment of a force by interfering with its logistical chain far more effectively than by a political interaction. The simple fact of not paying the fuel bill can disable transport, or preventing a shipment of munitions from getting to its departure point. That's the weak underbelly of response. And the problem there is it looks like incompetence, not an attack in most cases. The flip side about cyber defense, we see in the case of the major, I'll leave the proper noun out of it, everybody will know who I'm referring to. The large national retailer chain that compromised by, I think last count, 40 to 50 million credit cards, that had awareness of the alarm but didn't respond to it, even though they had a 24/7 SOC, had the software. The people who were tasked to respond when an alarm occurred raised the alarm, and that was the end of it. The alarm was ignored at Central. The same attack occurred at a large number of other national scale retailers and was similarly undetected until after the fact. So I'm not sure the problem is as simple as it might otherwise appear to be. There's a very complex failure to respond problem. And as one of our panelists noted, it's cash out of pocket. So it's a strategic, it's a arbitrage of whether you're more exposed to lose the money to a theft, or whether you're going to have to explain a budget for a non-existent, for a no-incident attack.
Richard, would you like to?
Yeah, well, I think your basic point is very right. Logistics is always the soft underbelly. When Jerry mentioned I had and have a pronounced interest in biological attack, it seemed to me if you could contaminate a point of disembarkation, you begin to get the same kinds of effects with a biological weapon. And militaries prefer to focus on the kinetic interactions on the battlefield and not to attend where you're quite rightly pointing to. The only point that I'd emphasize that would be a little different from where you were going, though I agree with the thrust of where you're going, is there are so many places you can look that while you're quite right in stressing the logistics point, we could also stress, for example, command control. To the extent modern militaries are phenomenally dependent on digital communication and integration of data to do that, it's a big problem if those are subverted. You could similarly point to warning indicators and the way in which we're dependent in those arenas. So as you suggest, I think the problems are very intense and complicated. Returning to an earlier point in the discussion about the workforce, if you take a suggestion like mine, which I very much believe in, let's, among other things in systems we really care about, put a human in the loop or involve some movement away from classic digital systems. You need to have people who are extraordinarily skilled in the warfare domain, both at warfare and at cyber, and how to insert those people and how to get that system operating optimally to trade off the sacrifices in efficiency and effectiveness for the gains in security and which people you're going to put in that system. Are they going to be smart enough to make good decisions? That's extraordinarily difficult and demands a very talented workforce. So I'm very aware that when I come meandering into this area and offer what I think is an important policy recommendation, it's just a lot easier for me to preach it than for people to practice it. And I think that's of a piece with the point you're making.
I have a question back there.
Thanks. So I think for better or for worse, much of the discussion around offense being stronger than defense revolves around zero-day vulnerabilities. I've seen many people propose solutions where the United States government would rapidly disclose every single vulnerability they knew about and attempt to find more along that same line. Private companies have followed suit along this line. Google's Project Zero is a great example where they've disclosed dozens and dozens of vulnerabilities in other vendors' products. So my question is, if we disclose all the bugs, will we finally be safe?
Well, others may want to comment on this. I'll be interested in their comments, but I'll just offer a brief response. The short answer to your question is no. If we disclose all the bugs, et cetera, we will not be safe, because we'll still be, even if we covered the universe of bugs, struck with the difficulties associated with social engineering and usurpation of privilege and manipulation of existing legitimate code and hardware vulnerabilities, concentration of power, et cetera, all the things to talk about. But the second thing is, we don't know all the vulnerabilities. Nobody knows all the vulnerabilities. So we could disclose all the vulnerabilities, and what we'll do is create more demand for people to go out and find more vulnerabilities. It's not a limited universe. There are other things to be said about this, and my colleagues, all of whom are more technically sophisticated than I am, thank God, can say more about these things, but those are the two key points that strike me first.
Well, I would like to also provide some thought on that. If you, again, look at the cyber-physical domain, the critical infrastructure, like power distribution, etc., the most difficult problems, the most severe vulnerabilities are not 0 days. And you know what? They're known. They're design features. They're designed into the products. Just for example, in the majority of industrial control systems, there is no authentication and authorization. So let me take this one step further. If you, Mr. Hacker, are trying to identify a buffer overflow, you don't know what you're doing. You're stupid because the main entrance is wide open. You don't have to find a back door. The front door is open. And these vulnerabilities are known. Unfortunately, DHS doesn't tell you about that because DHS has a specific policy. Anything that is not considered a bug, a software flaw, DHS does not consider a vulnerability, which I think is very misleading and inappropriate. But this is why we still have to live with all these known bugs. So in this little domain, the problem is just a little bit different than in big IT.
So I will jump in on that. I'm not sure that the situation with DHS is exactly as Ralph characterizes it there. I would say we have a lot of ways of communicating with the private sector, and we have very in-depth software assurance programs, for example, where we work with control systems vendors, and we work with them on what constitutes good design, you name it. Now, as we release vulnerability reports on things, alerts as to things that are new and in the environment, we can't send out a vulnerability report to alert the world every 3 months that software that was designed 10 years ago remains as vulnerable as it was 3 months ago, and 3 months before that, and 3 months before that. We have to temper what we release so that people, in fact, keep reading it, or we'll just become the people that cry wolf. But I think Ralph's broader point is incredibly important, which is, first, for those in the audience who are moving into computer science at all, security starts at the design stage. And then second, as we have taken things that were not internet connected, and this is key in Richard's paper as well, and connected them if not to the internet, then at least to a business system that is itself connected to the internet. We have enormous vulnerabilities that are not these backdoor, harder to find things. They are systemic, designed-in vulnerabilities that we are going to really struggle to fix.
So we have a question right there, and then I'll get back to Jerry. Yeah, it's you.
My question is, based on what you just said, based on what you just said, it starts at the design phase. So my question, I guess, talks to the teachers, etc. So in cybersecurity, or in development in computer technology, which I graduated eons ago, how do you get the mindset of the developers or the students coming out to place security as the top priority and not project development, project deliverables, etc.?
Stefan, would you like to? He's the teacher in the audience, so I had to call.
So I actually don't know that the hard part is in educating the grunt programmer on the ground to do this. I think that the challenge is actually that the incentive structure around commercial off-the-shelf software does not tend to reward that. Right? As time has gone on, we have moved to deploying faster. In fact, in the service-oriented software architecture that we're moving towards, we are having release cycles that are ever shorter. And I would say that overall, awareness of security has, I'd say, vastly improved over the last 10 years in the cadres of development programmers. And big companies that have actually been through the crucible of being attacked, the Microsofts of the world, who have put together security development lifecycle processes that are actually quite robust, where they're required to do threat modeling and they're required to do security testing and so forth. I think the place where we run into trouble is that we have all of these other incentives that cause us to increase complexity. And I think, as Richard alluded, one of the challenges, even in our critical infrastructure systems, we are basing them around commercial off-the-shelf software that was built for the broadest possible set of design criteria, which frequently is trading off a lot of other things. And so it is hard to make security job one, because security does not, in most cases, bring the money in. That said, I would say that the biggest problem tends to be in those sectors that have not been under attack. So I would say that by and large, desktop server operating systems are in great shape compared to the kinds of software that is running the power grid. Because the people who are running server operating systems have been getting attacked every year since 1993, and in order to stay in business, they have had to dramatically improve their security posture. The people who are building industrial controls or automotive have never had anyone attack them that they had to worry about. And so from a Darwinian standpoint, they have no immune response to the kinds of threats that are out there now that they're connected to the internet. And getting those people up to where we are everywhere else, I think, is a big challenge.
I would just add that as we move towards the Internet of Things, we move more and more towards companies maintaining software systems or implementing software systems that are not themselves in the software business. They think of themselves as in the business of whatever appliance they're selling. And that leads to both naivete with regard to this and insensitivity with regard to it. Also leads to a failure to implement mechanisms for updating and patching. So whatever you think your problems are with your periodic Patch Tuesday shipments from Microsoft about updating, once you install in your home or your automobile or elsewhere systems that are not capable of being updated, you're in a wildly worse position.
And this actually dovetails with the previous comment about 0 days, which is that the notion of vulnerability disclosure is tied up in an implicit assumption that we have a very cost-effective measure, once we have disclosed the vulnerability, to render it harmless, that you can download the patch. That is true for the things that we look at that look like computers. For the vast majority of computers deployed, in fact, it is not true. We do not have a cost-effective mechanism to render the vulnerabilities harmless, and that plays into the question of disclosure. Because as soon as you disclose, you have identified the mechanism by which you can attack these systems. We did a bunch of work in automotive, And we had to struggle. We ended up not actually describing in detail what the problems, we said, here are the class of problems, and we're not going to tell you exactly how we did it, because we did not have a reasonable way to get all those cars fixed.
Jerry? You? Oh.
So a lot of what you described strikes me as individuals or small consortiums or syndicates that are doing things that are hostile to different forces, finance, power, et cetera. It seemed to me that on the other side, that that people are smart, and over time they're going through an evolution of thought about what they have. And that is that isolated is insufficient to have consequence of any magnitude, but that if they began to profile 1,000 vulnerabilities and then thought about how they rippled them back into an attack, they could have a profound impact. And I assume someone's smart enough in the world of our enemies to be thinking like that. But I don't get a lot of sense from your discussion that you think that's a prevalent situation right now. So am I just talking about a future state of vulnerability, or is this just something we don't want to see right now? How do you evaluate the current situation of, I would say, really sophisticated players, not just hackers and not just attackers, but people say this is a true game of setting the stage for how the world operates?
I would see it just a little bit different. So what strikes me is the emergence of state-sponsored hacking, state-sponsored offensive cyber activity. And so all the major campaigns that we have discussed over the last couple of years, like the Tailwind breach, like the Energetic Bear campaign, etc., they obviously, or the Shamoon attack, they obviously are state-sponsored. At the same time, what is kind of puzzling is to see that the level of sophistication that is displayed in the attack strategy, in the attack code, etc., doesn't match the resources that you would expect. It doesn't match the skill sets that they would have. So my take on it is that what we are presently seeing is mostly nation-state, state-level players are throwing, let's just say, big resources into infiltration. Sometimes it appears to me like wholesale operations. So they're just trying to infiltrate any single water station, water facility in the US, every single honeypot. And the way they're doing it suggests you that this is basically done by amateurs. Does that make any sense? Well, for me, it perfectly does make sense. In the state of history that we are presently in, the infiltration beats the destructive capability. So at this point in time, what you really want to do as a nation-state player, you want to extend your reach, because this gives you deterrent capability. Now, the good thing about that is you don't have to execute the threat. Once that you would execute the threat, so let's just say you just take down parts of the electric grid in the United States. Once that you do that, even the last congressperson understands, okay, now this red line is crossed, the red line that Richard mentions. Now we have to do something. Now we are really getting serious about the problem. So the United States bolster up their cyber defense. However, that's bad news for all the potential attackers, you know, that cyber axis of evil. That's bad news for them. What they would really like to do is be able to play some form of deterrent in order to gain cyber power and to shift that power balance up to a point where most likely Richard's red line will be crossed. And as I see it, this crossing will not be achieved by one substantial blow, by a significant hit, but by by
I think
a
this will
large
be the last
number
question,
of
and
very,
right
very
after there'll
small
be coffee.
infiltrations.
Because we're running out.
And
Okay.
I think we don't have, we haven't found an appropriate response to this scenario.
I would just note conceptually, following that line of thought, there's an interesting question out there that I think warrants some discussion and has not been discussed, which is if you buy the proposition that I'm so fundamentally arguing that cybersecurity is, that cyber systems are inherently insecure, and if you believe that decision makers can be educated to that point, both here and in China and in Russia, for example, does that make the world fundamentally more secure because people realize that they can't be confident about the effects of attacking one another? Or does it make the world more insecure because people don't really know what's going to happen? And that seems to me to be a pretty important question on which we're not seeing discussion.
Maybe on that note, we're running out of time. So that was the last question. There'll be a coffee outside, so you can. The panelists will be around for some more time. So please ask your questions, get your questions answered, and so on. And thank you once again.
Thank you.